October 12th, 2005, 03:47 hours, Highway 1, 60 kilometers south of Kabul. Out of every 100 convoys that rolled through Logar province, 12 never made it through intact. The Taliban had perfected their kill zone, IEDs buried at culverts, triggermen with cell phones on the hillsides, backup RPG teams waiting for survivors. Sergeant Marcus Webb sat in the gunner's turret of the lead Humvee, gripping something that would get him court-martialed if anyone noticed, a $60 civilian radio from the Kabul Bazaar. No encryption, no authorization, no chance it would work according to every officer who'd laughed at the idea. But in the next 90 minutes, his convoy would pass through 3 prepared ambush sites without a single detonation. Not because of luck, because Webb had figured out what everyone else missed. The enemy's greatest strength was also their fatal weakness. Marcus Webb was not born to be a soldier. Dalton, Georgia. Population 27,000. The kind of town where your father worked third shift at the carpet mill and your mother cleaned houses to make rent. Webb was born in 1976, middle child of 5. And the closest thing to adventure in Dalton was the Jiffy Lube, where he changed oil at 16. His father Raymond told him once, standing in their driveway while replacing an alternator, "Every machine talks to you, son. You just gotta listen to what it's saying." Years later, that single sentence would save 43 lives. But in 1994, Webb was just another high school graduate without prospects, working full-time as a line mechanic, married at 21, settled into the rhythm of small-town Georgia life where nothing much changed. Then September 11th happened. Webb enlisted 3 weeks after the towers fell. He was 25 years old, too old to be idealistic about it. When he told his wife Sarah, she cried. His father just nodded once, understanding that some things you do because they need doing, not because you want to. Fort Benning, combat engineer training, learning to clear mines, probe roads for IEDs, build bridges under fire. His drill sergeants noted he was adequate and steady, military speak for unremarkable. But what they didn't see was Webb filling a notebook with observations, timing patterns, blast intervals, distance calculations between detonations and vehicle positions, the kind of obsessive detail work that got him nicknamed Professor and Rainman by other soldiers. Staff Sergeant Kowalski told him once, "Webb, you're overthinking this. Just drive and shoot back." What Kowalski didn't understand was that Webb wasn't overthinking. He was listening to what the pattern was saying. By October 2005, Highway 1 through Logar province had become a graveyard. The Taliban had perfected something terrifying: coordinated ambushes using civilian technology, spotters on hillsides with binoculars and handheld FM radios, triggermen in ditches with Nokia cell phones wired to artillery shells. The system was simple, deadly, and completely invisible to American counter-IED equipment designed to jam military frequencies. 6 convoys hit in September alone. 14 killed, 32 wounded. Coalition forces tried everything. Route clearance teams sweeping ahead, too slow. Varied departure times. Insurgents just waited. Aerial reconnaissance. Spotters hid until helicopters passed. The fundamental problem was this: American jammers targeted military radio frequencies. But the Taliban were using commercial FM bands between 87.5 and 89.5 megahertz, the same frequencies as civilian radio stations. Nobody was jamming those. Webb noticed it during his first month. He'd hear music from local radio stations on civilian radios in villages. Then he'd watch insurgents on hillsides with handheld radios just before ambushes. The pieces connected slowly in his mind. What if they're coordinating on those same civilian frequencies? What if the reason our jammers don't work is because we're jamming the wrong channels? He brought it up to Staff Sergeant Kowalski in August. "Sarge, I think the insurgents are using civilian FM frequencies to coordinate. We should monitor those bands." Kowalski barely looked up. "Webb, they use cell phones and military radios. Intel already tracks that. But what if they're also using—" "Drop it, Sergeant. Focus on your actual job." 2 weeks later, Webb tried Lieutenant Briggs. Same response. Civilian frequencies weren't a concern. That was for intelligence to worry about, not engineers. So Webb went to the Kabul Electronics Bazaar and spent $60 of his own money on a Motorola civilian FM radio, two-way capability, programmable frequencies, battery-powered. He started monitoring it during convoy runs, scanning through 87.5 to 89.5 megahertz, listening. What he heard confirmed everything. Pashto voices, sporadic transmissions, position reports, convoy approach warnings. The entire Taliban spotter network operating on channels the military wasn't even listening to. Other soldiers thought he was crazy. Professors talking to ghosts again. Rain Man and his magic radio. But Webb kept listening, kept recording observations, kept mapping which frequencies the spotters used, and slowly, a solution formed, one that would violate every communications protocol in the army. So why did Highway 1 matter so much? 300 miles between Kabul and Kandahar, the only ground supply route connecting northern and southern Afghanistan. Every gallon of fuel, every ammunition crate, every medical supply traveled this single road through Taliban country. If Highway 1 became impassable, Kandahar would be isolated. The entire southern campaign depended on this artery remaining open. The Taliban understood this perfectly. They trained with al-Qaeda in sophisticated IED construction, pressure plates, command wires, remote detonation via multiple redundant systems. Their spotters operated in cells, communicating across kilometers, coordinating timing with precision that rivaled military operations, and the Americans had no answer for it. Standard counter-IED doctrine focused on route clearance, vehicle armor, and military frequency jamming. None of it addressed the fundamental problem. Insurgents coordinating on civilian bands with commercial equipment available at any electronics market. If the convoys stopped moving through Logar province, logistics would collapse within weeks. Helicopter resupply was too expensive, too limited, too vulnerable. Ground commanders estimated they had maybe a month before the strategic situation became critical. October 11th, 2005. Webb's company received orders. Convoy departure 0300 hours. 18 vehicles. Fuel and ammunition for FOB Warrior in Ghazni. Route: Highway 1 through Logar province. The briefing was matter of fact. Expected travel time: 4 hours. Expected contact: probable. Webb packed his gear that night and slipped the civilian radio into his cargo pocket. He'd been testing a theory for 3 weeks, that continuous transmission on Taliban spotter frequencies would jam their coordination just like military jammers worked. The problem was, it violated about 6 different regulations. Using unauthorized communications equipment on operations could get him court-martialed. But the math was simple. Follow regulations and watch convoys get shredded by coordinated ambushes. Or break the rules and maybe disrupt their kill chain. October 12th, 03:15 hours, Bagram Motor Pool. 18 vehicles assembled in pre-dawn darkness. 12 M11, 14 Humvees, 4 fuel trucks, 2 ammunition trucks, 43 soldiers. Fog reduced visibility to 30 meters, turning headlights into dim halos in the frozen air. Webb climbed into the turret of Humvee 3, checking his M240B machine gun. 700 rounds of 7.62 millimeter ammunition. The civilian radio sat beside him, small and out of place next to military equipment. Lieutenant Briggs walked past during final inspections. He noticed the radio. Webb: "What the hell is that?" "Personal communications, sir, for emergencies." Briggs stared at him. The radio was obviously not authorized. But with 40 other things to worry about before convoy departure, he just shook his head and moved on. The convoy rolled out at 03:30, 15 minutes late due to fog. Speed: 45 kilometers per hour. Spacing: 50 meters between vehicles. Standard protocol that made targeting simple for anyone watching from the hills. Webb's hand rested on the civilian radio. He'd tuned it to 87.9 megahertz, the frequency he'd heard Taliban spotters using most frequently. His thumb hovered over the transmit button. If he pressed it, he'd be committing to the most unauthorized tactical decision of his military career. If he didn't, he'd watch pattern repeat. Spotters coordinate. IEDs detonate. Soldiers die. At 0347, approaching Logar province, he saw it. A flash of light on the eastern hillside, 300 meters up. Not a weapon. A handheld light signaling. Spotters communicating. Webb pressed. Transmit. Static flooded 87.9 megahertz. On the hillside, a Taliban spotter keyed his radio. Convoy, approaching Sector 3. Nothing transmitted. The frequency was jammed by continuous carrier signal. Webb held the transmit button down. No words, just white noise blocking the channel. His left hand locked around the small plastic switch. His right hand gripped the M240B. 400 meters ahead, an IED waited in a culvert. The triggerman pressed speed dial on his Nokia. Nothing happened. Webb's transmission created electromagnetic interference, disrupting cell signals within 50 meters. The convoy passed over the culvert at 0349. No explosion. Webb watched thermal signatures through his optics. 3 men, 200 meters up the eastern slope, moving parallel to the convoy. They held long objects, probably RPGs. But no hostile action yet. ROE required positive identification. His thumb began cramping around the transmit button. The constant pressure required surprising strength. He shifted his grip, using his palm instead, pressing the entire radio against the turret's metal frame. The convoy commander's voice crackled over the military radio. All vehicles, maintain speed and spacing. Keep scanning sectors. Webb couldn't respond. Using the military radio while transmitting on the civilian frequency would interfere with both, so he stayed silent, kept jamming, hoped nobody questioned why he wasn't acknowledging commands. At 0352, the convoy approached a narrow bend, where the road pinched between steep hills. Webb's notebook had recorded 3 IED strikes at this exact location in the past month. Perfect ambush geometry, vehicles forced to slow, hillsides providing cover for triggermen and RPG teams. Through thermal imaging, Webb counted 9 heat signatures, 5 on the left hillside, 4 on the right, all stationary, all holding long objects. They were waiting for the IED blast that would signal the ambush. The insurgents held fire. Discipline intact. The triggerman at the base of the western hill keyed his radio. Detonate now. His transmission was drowned in static. Webb's continuous carrier waves swallowed every syllable. He pressed redial on his cell phone backup system. The call wouldn't connect. The convoy rolled through the narrows at 0353. No explosion. The insurgents waited, confused by the failure. By the time they decided to fire RPGs anyway, the convoy had cleared the kill zone. One RPG launched late, impacting 60 meters behind the last vehicle. Just dirt and smoke. Webb's thumb was numb. The radio's battery indicator showed 3/4 remaining. He calculated rapidly. 4-hour convoy, current drain rate, needed to manage power. He released the transmit button for 10 seconds. Blood rushed back into his hand with pins and needles intensity. During that 10-second gap, Taliban communications resumed. Fragments of Pashto crackled through. Signal blocked. Cannot trigger. Interference. They knew something was wrong, but couldn't identify the source. Webb pressed transmit again, flooding the frequency. Specialist Rodriguez in the turret behind him shouted over engine noise, "Webb, what are you doing with that radio?" Webb couldn't answer without releasing the transmit button. He just pointed at the hills, then at the radio. Rodriguez stared for a moment, then nodded slowly and rotated his weapon to cover the eastern sector. At 0358, approaching Muhammad Aga village, Webb saw headlights ahead. A civilian truck parked sideways across half the highway, forcing the convoy to slow and navigate around it. Classic Taliban technique. Use civilian obstacles to slow convoys. Detonate IEDs when vehicles maneuver at reduced speed. The convoy dropped to 20 kilometers per hour. Webb maintained transmission despite his hand trembling from sustained pressure. The civilian radio's plastic casing was warm against his palm, electronics overheating from continuous use beyond their designed duty cycle. The lead Humvee maneuvered around the truck at 0359. Nothing. Second vehicle. Nothing. Webb's vehicle passed the obstacle. The parked truck's driver stood beside it, watching with an expression visible even in the darkness. Confusion. Maybe fear. He held a cell phone, but wasn't speaking into it. The triggerman hidden 40 meters south pressed his detonator repeatedly. His Nokia showed full signal strength, but the call wouldn't connect. Webb's localized electromagnetic interference disrupted cellular communication at the exact moment it mattered most. The carefully positioned IED sat inert as all 18 vehicles passed. The convoy cleared Muhammad Agha at 0402, speed increasing back to 45 kilometers per hour. Webb's hand was cramping badly, fingers locked in a claw around the radio. He forced himself to release for 15 seconds, shaking blood back into his extremities. His shoulder ached from bracing against the turret during continuous bumps and turns. The next 30 kilometers passed without incident. Dawn broke at 0430, gray light revealing the landscape, barren hills, scattered compounds, Highway 1 stretching south through rocky terrain. Webb could see better now, but couldn't risk stopping transmission. Taliban often staged secondary ambushes hours after initial contact, assuming convoys would relax their guard after the first danger zone. At 0445, near Pool Ayalam, the battery indicator dropped to 1/4. 90 minutes of convoy time remaining. Current drain rate unsustainable. Webb switched to pulse transmissions. 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off. Enough disruption to prevent coordinated attacks while conserving power. During the 15-second gaps, he heard Taliban communications resume. Fragmented. Frustrated. Dot lost contact with forward position. Convoy already past checkpoint 2. Signal is blocked somehow. They knew something was disrupting their network. But Webb's transmission looked like random radio interference, common in the electromagnetic chaos of military operations. They couldn't identify the source. At 0503, the convoy approached Gardez Junction, the final high-risk area. Intelligence had identified this location as the Taliban's most sophisticated ambush site. 7 IEDs daisy-chained along 200 meters, designed to destroy multiple vehicles simultaneously. Triggermen on both sides with backup cell phones and radios. Overkill intended to guarantee catastrophic damage. Webb abandoned his battery conservation plan. He broadcast continuously as they entered the kill zone, ignoring the pain in his hand, focusing only on maintaining pressure on that small plastic button. His shoulder pressed hard against the turret rim. The smell of hot electronics filled the air. The radio's casing was almost too hot to hold. The convoy moved through at 0505. One by one, 18 vehicles crossing the daisy-chained IED line. The triggermen, positioned 300 meters apart, pressed their detonators. Nothing happened. The devices required simultaneous activation to create the intended chain reaction. But the triggermen's radios were jammed, their cell phones disrupted, their coordination destroyed by a $60 civilian radio transmitting continuous static. At 0512, the convoy cleared Logar province entirely, entering Paktia province, where Taliban activity was minimal. Webb released the transmit button for the last time. His hand shook uncontrollably. The civilian radio's battery indicator showed 5% remaining. He set it down carefully, the casing still hot, and flexed his fingers, trying to work feeling back into them. His throat was dry. He hadn't drunk water in 2 hours, hadn't spoken in 90 minutes. Around him, the convoy maintained formation, unaware they'd just bypassed 3 separate ambushes. The convoy reached FOB Warrior at 0645. All fuel and ammunition delivered intact. 43 soldiers, 0 casualties. 0 hostile contact officially logged because no shots had been fired, no IEDs had detonated. Lieutenant Briggs dismounted, surprised. Quietest run through Logar I've ever had. Webb climbed down from the turret, legs stiff, shoulder bruised, hand blistered under his glove. He tucked the civilian radio into his cargo pocket and said nothing. 3 hours later, intelligence reports arrived from surveillance assets monitoring Taliban communications. The reports noted unusual enemy radio traffic during the convoy's movement, multiple references to signal interference, blocked communications, and convoy passed without engagement. Captain Martinez called a debriefing. Webb sat across the table from officers, reviewing maps showing the convoy's route through 3 prepared ambush sites. Intelligence says the Taliban tried to trigger IEDs at 0349, 0353, and 0505. Martinez said, "All attempts failed. Their communications were disrupted." He looked around the room. "Anyone know why?" Silence. Then Webb spoke quietly. "I was jamming their frequencies, sir." Every head turned. "With what equipment?" "Civilian FM radio. $60 Motorola from the Kabul Bazaar." Briggs stared at him. "That unauthorized radio I saw?" Webb nodded. Martinez's expression was unreadable. "You jammed enemy communications with a handheld civilian radio?" "I monitored their spotter frequencies for 3 weeks. They coordinate on FM bands between 87.5 and 89.5 megahertz. I transmitted continuously on 87.9, blocking their channel. Also created enough electromagnetic interference to disrupt cell phone triggers within 50 meters. The room was silent. Finally, Martinez said, "You did this without orders? Without coordinating with anyone?" "Yes, sir. Standard counter IED. Equipment jams military frequencies. Nobody was covering civilian bands." "You realize that's not standard operating procedure?" Webb nodded. "Yes, sir. But the protocol was getting us killed." 72 hours later, a convoy of officers arrived from Bagram, a colonel from 10th Mountain Division, 2 majors from intelligence, a civilian contractor from DARPA. They interviewed Webb for 4 hours. He showed them his notebook, frequencies logged, patterns identified, timing calculations. He demonstrated how continuous transmission on commercial FM bands could jam Taliban spotter networks. He explained the accidental discovery that it also disrupted cell phone triggers through electromagnetic interference. "Why didn't you report this to your chain of command?" the colonel asked. Webb hesitated. "I tried to, sir. 2 months ago, Staff Sergeant Kowalski told me I was overthinking things. Lieutenant Briggs said civilian frequencies weren't our concern, so you proceeded on your own." "Yes, sir. Seemed like someone should try it." The officers conferred privately. Then the colonel returned. "Sergeant Webb, your technique directly violates standard communications protocols. However, the results speak for themselves. We're going to test your approach with proper equipment. No medal. No ceremony. Just acknowledgement that the unauthorized idea worked." For the next 6 months, Webb rode in lead vehicle turrets with his civilian radio, jamming Taliban frequencies on every convoy through Logar province. Other soldiers copied his technique, purchasing cheap radios at bazaars, monitoring enemy frequencies, transmitting during high-threat sectors. By March 2006, the Army's Communications Electronics Command at Fort Monmouth had developed a formalized system based on Webb's improvised method, the Civilian Band Electronic Warfare Suite. It deployed to Afghanistan in May 2006, integrated into convoy operations across Regional Command East. The system used military-grade equipment to jam commercial radio frequencies and create localized cellular disruption. But the tactical concept came directly from Webb's notebook: monitor civilian bands, identify enemy patterns, jam during convoy operations. Years later, instructors at the Army's Maneuver Captain's Career Course at Fort Moore taught a case study labeled Adaptive Electronic Warfare, Highway 1, October 2005. The case study described an unnamed NCO who identified enemy communications patterns and developed an effective countermeasure using civilian equipment. Most instructors presented it as a lesson in initiative versus obedience. Students studied the tactical innovation, the breach of protocol, and the strategic impact. The technique itself became doctrine. Tactical Commander's Guide to Electronic Warfare, Appendix D. Non-standard frequency jamming. Webb's name appeared nowhere in the document. After his deployment ended in September 2006, Marcus Webb returned to Dalton, Georgia. He was 30 years old. He resumed work as a mechanic at a Chevrolet dealership on Cleveland Highway. He married Sarah again. They'd stayed together through 2 deployments and bought a small house on Spring Street. He never spoke much about the convoys. When asked about his service, "Did my job," came home. Friends who pressed for details received only. Drove trucks through Afghanistan. Hot, dusty, boring. He coached Little League Baseball for his son's team, the Dalton Tigers. He worked on cars 6 days a week. He attended Northside Baptist Church on Sundays. He became, again, unremarkable, a middle-aged mechanic in a small Georgia town, distinguished by nothing except the quiet knowledge of what he'd done when it mattered. Webb passed away in November 2019 at age 43, Heart attack while replacing a transmission at the dealership. His obituary ran 4 lines in the Daily Citizen News. Marcus Webb, 43, Army veteran and mechanic, died November 12th. Survived by wife Sarah, son Raymond, daughter Emily. Services at Ponder's Funeral Home. His grave is in West Hill Cemetery on a hillside overlooking Dalton. The headstone reads, S.G.T. Marcus Webb, U.S. Army, Afghanistan 2005 to 2006. Beloved husband and father. Most people walk past without noticing, but every October 12th, a small group gathers there. 4 soldiers from his old company, Major Briggs, retired, and Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, retired. They place a small civilian Motorola radio beside the headstone, tell stories about the convoys, and remember the mechanic from Georgia who listened to what the pattern was saying. Sarah keeps his Bronze Star in a drawer, awarded posthumously in 2020 after Lieutenant Colonel Martinez pushed the paperwork through. She's never displayed it. When asked why, Marcus wouldn't have wanted the attention. He just did what made sense. There's a temptation to believe that wars are won by advanced technology, superior firepower, overwhelming force. That innovation comes from laboratories and think tanks, from officers trained at war colleges and engineers with advanced degrees. But what about the mechanic from Dalton, who understood that machines, including insurgent networks, have patterns and vulnerabilities? What about the sergeant who trusted his observations more than doctrine, who improvised solutions with $60 radios when $1 million systems failed? Marcus Webb didn't win the war in Afghanistan. He didn't destroy Taliban networks or secure Logar province permanently, but he saved 43 lives on one convoy by recognizing that the enemy's greatest strength, their communications coordination, was also their greatest vulnerability. His father's wisdom proved true. Every machine talks to you. You just have to listen to what it's saying. The Taliban's ambush network was a machine, coordinated, predictable, operating on specific frequencies. Webb listened. Then he disrupted the conversation with a tool so simple, so obvious, that nobody had thought to try it. The insurgents called it interference. The army called it adaptive electronic warfare. Webb called it common sense. So here's what I want to know. What would you have done in Webb's position? Would you have risked violating protocol to test an unauthorized technique? Would you have trusted your observations over standard operating procedure when following the rules meant watching people die? And here's the thing that gets me about this story. Which part surprised you most? That a $60 civilian radio could disrupt sophisticated Taliban ambush networks? Or that the military hadn't considered monitoring commercial frequencies before a mechanic from Georgia figured it out? Let us know in the comments below. Tell us what you think about the gap between innovation and protocol, between what's authorized and what's effective. Because I guarantee someone reading this has their own story about a time the rule book failed and improvisation saved lives. If you believe that history is written by ordinary people solving problems in extraordinary ways, share this with someone who thinks heroism requires permission. Share it with someone who's ever been told they're overthinking a problem when they were actually the only one seeing the pattern. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one issued by the military. It's the one you figure out yourself when nobody's watching. Because sometimes listening matters more than following orders. Because sometimes one person with a cheap radio is enough.